We looked at the Renewable Energy 2022 report from the International Energy Agency. The same agency also puts out these reports on energy efficiency each year. This is Energy Efficiency 2022. Basically looks at investments in various energy efficiency measures, including energy intensity improvements. And you know from the KI identity, which we discussed elsewhere, energy intensity is basically amount of energy used per unit of GDP. So it's energy intensity of the GDP, and then we typically look at carbon intensity of the energy to get an idea of where a country is headed. So this is the annual global primary energy intensity improvements by scenario, 20 for 2001 to 2022 and 2021 to 2030. So it's a nice comparison with respect to the historic period as to where we are headed and where we can expect to go in the coming decade or so. This is STEPS, where it is stated policy scenario. APS is the announced pledges scenario under various international agreements like the nationally determined contributions, and of course there are the net zero emissions scenario, where we looked at the net zero 2050 by IEA as to where we have to be by 2030 to get to net zero by 2050 or so. The primary energy intensity improvements in percentages, 2001 to 2010 there was a 1% increase, 2011 to 2015 there was just over 2% increase. We dropped again to just over 1% in 2016 to 2019. Obviously these depend on various issues like how quickly a country is growing, or what happens with the fuel supply, perturbations to the fuel supply like with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or whether a country invested heavily into war or into developing infrastructure at the cost of just economic growth, for example, and so on. 2020 and 2021 down there. 2020, of course, the pandemic years hammered the entire global humanity, and of course many species benefited by the reduced human activities, as we know. But the estimated 2022 energy intensity improvement is at 2%, still a tad bit under 2011 to 2015 number, and under the stated policy scenario for 2021 to 2030 we're expected to remain at 2% improvement, and for the announced pledges scenario that jumps to 3% in terms of energy intensity per GDP. So that's somewhat of a good news, but for achieving net zero we have to be over 4% improvement in the energy intensity. So we are lagging behind as usual. Year on year change in energy price inflation for October 22. Obviously the economies, in fact there were dire predictions of global slowdowns and so on and so forth because of inflation. US discussed this a lot in terms of its budgets and taxes and incentives and so on, but nonetheless percentage change over the same period previous year for October 2022, you can see that the various countries like Turkey, Netherlands were up here, and other countries have been suffering from energy price inflation as well. You can pick United States, which is at 18%. So how the countries shield against or buffer the energy price inflation depends on various subsidies and tax incentives. For example, Europe taxes energy heavily, whereas US doesn't tax gas. You can go pump gas in any state. The state prices vary depending on which state is giving you the least local tax versus federal tax, and so on and so forth. Mexico is down here, Israel, Spain, and Czech Republic, Canada are all at the bottom, but the poorer countries, so Turkey paid a heavy price in terms of energy inflation, and then you have other countries like Belgium, UK is up here at 59, Denmark is at 53, Austria is at 50, and so on. So Ireland and the rest are below 50%. So this obviously affected people in different ways, and it depends on the proportion of transport fuel price increases passed through to customers. For example, looking at those by region, we are looking at December 20 to December 21 average pass-through, so how the inflation on gasoline is passed to the consumer by the vendors, companies, and so on. Then for January 22 to April 2022 average pass-through. So the pandemic had a huge impact. So in terms of high income economies, nearly all of the percentage price increase was passed through to the consumers. In 2022, beginning of 2022 first quarter, it dropped to just over 60%. In Latin America and Caribbean, more than 80% was passed through to consumers, dropped in the first quarter to just over 40%. Emerging and developing Asia passed on 75% or more of the energy price increase to consumers, and first quarter that dropped to just under 60%. So they still have quite a bit of passing through to consumers in terms of increases in energy prices. Emerging and developing Europe, this is Asia, this is Europe, this is Sub-Saharan Africa, and Caucasus and Central Asia, Middle East and North Africa, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Okay, so obviously this is just relative to their own prices and their own passing through to customers, consumers, whereas the consumption itself is going to be very different. So the net amount paid as a part of the income depends on what the per capita GDP is and so on, and how much is spent on transportation. Global spending in clean energy and recovery for 2020 to 2023 projections in US $billion for 2020 to 2023. Government spending, so you have here energy efficiency related investments, 66%, and other clean energy and sustainable recovery at 34%. So that's $400 billion. So in general, IEA is optimistic about how we are doing in terms of transitioning to renewable energies and investments in efficiencies. So mobilized spending includes private and public spending mobilized by government action. So this is mobilized spending in that sense. 60% on energy efficiency related activities, policies, incentivizations, and 40% other clean energy and sustainable recovery investments mobilized by the government in terms of private and public spending. Okay, global energy efficiency related investments by scenario for 2015 to 2022 and average annual investment by scenario for 2026 to 2030. I have a chopper going by which made some noise, hopefully didn't spoil my recording. Again, looking at billions of US dollars pegged at 2021, you can look at various portfolio items like industry with energy efficiency, buildings, transport, industry in terms of electrification and end use, buildings in terms of electrification and end use, and transportation in terms of electrification. So again, you can see that from 2015 excuse me, technically I can edit these these coughing beats out of the recording, but but I'm not doing that because I'm a bit lazy. Nonetheless, electrification of transportation. So you can see that each item has grown a little, with industry doing not as much, but needs to do more under the net zero emission scenario, or 2026 to 2030. Buildings have done better in terms of LEEDs and other green certifications. The electrification of buildings and transportation is not shown here, but industry and buildings have also essentially remained the same, and transportation, if anything, took a dip in 2020 and then recovered in 21 and estimated 22 amounts in terms of billions of dollars invested in efficiency related issues. So in terms of stated policy scenario, this remains at investments expected over 2026 to 2030 as over $750 billion. The scales here are different, so you have to be careful. And what is required for hitting the net zero emissions during 2026-2030. So the goal is 2050 net zero, but what do we have to do now to move towards that? Obviously, buildings have to do a lot in terms of energy efficiency and electrification and end use both, and industries have to do more in terms of electrification and efficiency as well. And there is the transportation energy efficiency and transportation electrification. So the internal combustion engines have to be phased out and electrification has to take over. That's why you don't see as much here in terms of energy efficiency of transport, but there are some delayed phasing out of long haul transports and so on and so forth. In terms of change in energy demand and drivers in the International Energy Agency countries, you can look up that list elsewhere. Over 2000 to 2020, you can see that the change in energy demand have increased, and then there was a dip because of the COVID lockdowns and slowdowns. Total final energy consumptions have dipped and went up a little before the dip because of the COVID happened. And you have structure of the energy demand and you have efficiency changes, so drivers and changes. So that's not necessarily all good news, but if you look at typical annual household energy bills by Building Energy Performance Certificate rating in the UK at summer 2019 and October 22 prices, you can see the annual bill at 2019 price, an increase in bill over 2019 to 2022. These are the various efficiency ratings of the energy performance, and in each case there has been a substantial increase in bill over 2019 to 2022. So energy inflation in terms of average annual energy bill in US dollars has hit the UK pretty hard over 2022. More recently, all related to Russian invasion of Ukraine, gas supply dropping, colder temperatures, heat waves coming along, and floods and so on. So overall there has been a lot of subsidies given by the government to people to help them with their energy bills as well. Fuel bills for different personal vehicle types in Europe for June 21 to June 22, again indicative of 12-month fuel bill in US dollars. 10-year best-selling and best-selling in 2021 for crossover SUV petrol. So you can see that there is additional bill here compared to the 10-year average, and similarly for the best-selling vehicle of 2021. For medium-sized car and compact cars, obviously consumption itself is lower, but still the inflation has hit people pretty hard, with compact EVs doing better, even though even there you have some additional price being paid in terms of June 22 fuel prices. So obviously fuel prices have hit the entire global consumer industry, consumer patterns in terms of increased costs. This is proportion of residential heating energy consumption by fuel source in selected countries. Obviously, poorer countries pay much more in terms of fraction of total income to energy. So Argentina is paying for gas almost 100%, with a little bit for oil and a little bit for electricity. Netherlands, similarly, very high percentage in terms of gas. This is why the gas dependency of these countries got heavily hammered by the Russian supply dwindling or being manipulated because of the Ukrainian invasion. Part of the geopolitical goal of the invasion was to assert this power on energy supplies, which is playing out still in terms of Russian oil being sold under sanctions with price restrictions and so on and so forth. US of course relies a lot on gas as well. If we go down all the way here, there are countries like New Zealand which rely much less on gas, more so on oil, biofuels and waste, and electricity. So you can see the energy mix itself changes quite a bit. Estonia, Chile, Finland, Sweden and Norway all rely very little on gas, much more on oil. Chile is heavily dependent on coal. Of course, Poland quite a bit relying on coal. Czech Republic, Belarus, Ukraine here, and of course you have US still continuing to use a little bit of coal as well. So there are also countries requiring heat, not just the regular fossil fuels, but you also have larger reliance on electricity in Norway, for example, as opposed to other countries. In fact, it's the largest reliance on on electricity for residential heating energy consumption. Percentage of change in annual average final energy demand in selected emerging market and developing economies countries 2000 to 2019, annual average final energy demand percentage change in Africa. So 2000 to 2010 versus 2011 to 2019, there's generally been a drop in the annual average final energy demand in emerging market and developing economies countries. So that's again an impact of price changes. Policy package approach to strengthening energy efficiency, recommendations from the IEA report targets. Policies are more effective when they are set in the context of clear strategies and targets. So near-term and long-term plans are needed. And essential elements include regulation, information, incentives, and implementation is as important as policy design, of course, ensuring that the resources are in place to put policies into action, address vital elements such as capacity building, enforcement, and monitoring. It's important to continually assess policies and programs so as to keep up to date with the technology development. Okay, so incentives make efficient options more attractive and speed up the upgrade and replacement, whereas regulation is essential to exclude the worst performing equipment and practices from the market, to drive average efficiency levels up, and to set rules for the measurements of performance. So you have to use top-down regulations and market up incentives and bottom-up incentives to drive efficiency improvements. Contributing forces to why 2022 could be a turning point for energy efficiency. This is part of the overall IEA optimistic message about transitions and impact of Russian war, in fact, being helpful for faster transition over Europe, for example. Countries mobilize over $1 trillion on efficiency measures in crisis response packages. National plans with a major focus on efficiency launched by 16 governments representing over half of global energy use. Global wave of energy awareness campaigns is helping citizens take actions to reduce demand. Digital demand response helps manage several major power supply emergencies. Heat pump incentives currently operating in countries covering half of global energy use in buildings. We've talked about heat pump versus air conditioning elsewhere in terms of how efficiency, cost, and operating costs over time, etc., matter in using heat pumps as opposed to air conditioning. 1 in every 8 cars sold is electric thanks to strong consumer demand and government support. But of course, the energy that charge these vehicles have to be clean as well. So we have a long way to go in terms of renewable energies to run electric vehicles. Cooling efficiency policies implemented or under development in all ASEAN countries, which include these. 31 emerging and developing economy governments are developing new building codes, bringing total up to 111 once enacted. Efficiency savings made since 2000 saved IEA countries US dollars 680 billion in energy costs this year alone. So you know that there is an impact that is being felt on the pocket already. The events of 2022 have nonetheless changed the dynamics of energy markets for decades to come. In the wake of these disruptions, energy efficiency has received a series of major global boosts. So this talking about the pandemic and the Russian war and where we are left in terms of the dynamics of energy markets. Global energy efficiency investment is increasing fast, with governments, industry, and households investing $560 billion this year, which is a new record. Energy efficiency related spending is making up to 2/3 of all clean energy and recovery spending. Recovery spending is the stimulus to recover from economic slowdowns during the pandemic. With US $1 trillion mobilized since 2020, at least 16 high-profile national plans are driving this progress on efficiency, including the US Inflation Reduction Act, the REPowerEU plan, the Japan's Green Transformation Initiative, and so on. A rising wave of energy-saving awareness campaigns is helping millions of citizens better manage energy use and make efficiency-related decisions. Existing building codes are being strengthened and new ones are being introduced in emerging and developing countries. Cooling strategies are being introduced in regions with fastest growing demand for air conditioning. Okay, so countries like India and China must follow these pathways. The especially considering how many new buildings they are building. The electrification of transport and heating looks to have reached a turning point. 1 in every 8 cars sold globally is now electric, while almost 3 million heat pumps are sold in 2022 in Europe alone, as they become the preferred heating option. The value that energy efficiency brings to consumers increased dramatically this year given sharply higher prices. So the price increases also drive people towards better options, better choices. While energy cost of living pressures have risen considerably, efficiency actions implemented over the last 20 years are now saving consumers in IEA countries US dollars 680 billion of their energy bills this year at current prices, as we already mentioned in the previous slides. Finally, despite these welcome causes for optimism, several barriers to faster progress remain, which we almost always have to take into account. And there are also various communities, groups, projects, NGOs that look at how these things are actually implemented in which countries and which income groups continue to emit a lot. There has been a massive scale-up of fossil fuel subsidies as governments seek to cushion the impact of higher energy prices on household bills, like the UK that I mentioned. Over US $550 billion of temporary support has been added over the last years. If support is not well targeted, this could weaken the case for energy efficiency. Okay, so this is an emergency tiding over to help people, but this shouldn't weaken the progress. Energy transitions. Energy efficiency investment is highly concentrated in advanced economies. If global efficiency improvements are to accelerate, investment and policy covering the other 60% of energy consumption in EMDs must be emerging and developing economies must be strengthened. The COVID-19 crisis saw a shift towards more energy intensive industry. Energy efficiency progress will continue to be stymied if strong industrial demand for energy persists without a major improvement in industrial energy efficiency. I have a separate podcast on transparency of various corporations in their net zero plans, emission reduction plans, and so on. The news is not so great, so it's always greenwashing kind of acts have to be kept in mind. Much of the energy demand reduction that has taken place may be a negative consequence of slowing business or consumers foregoing energy services to save money. So you don't know exactly whether this is a sustained change or it's just a temporary bump in the road. Short-term efforts to save energy can easily revert back to past patterns of behavior once the crisis eases. This is something that always has to be taken into account as to whether they are secular trends or real changes in behavior, consumption, emission, and so on. Okay?